wonder what makes bread rise.
I don't know!
So soft and fluffy. I know, I'll go to the local bakery. Welcome to my bakery. Hi, Baker Bo. You're the best baker I know. Your cakes are always so fluffy, and I was wondering how you make your breads and cakes so amazing.
Thank you so much. I love baking breads and cakes all the time. If you really want to know my secret, I'll tell you. My secret ingredient is organic chemistry.
It all began when I was a student in Orgo, Chem 262.
Today in Real Life Orgo, we'll be talking about the chemistry of baking.
I never knew there was organic chemistry in baking.
There's organic chemistry in everything. This is especially true about baking because it involves a lot of organic molecules like proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids. One of the things that bakers have to worry about is leavening, or getting their dough to rise. There are both inorganic and organic leavening agents. The most common organic leavening agent is yeast. Why is yeast so popular at parties?
Why, Professor?
Because he's a fun guy. Many people don't know that yeast is a living organism. Yeast has been used to make bread since ancient times, but the scientist Louis Pasteur was the one who really mastered the art of fermentation. Dry baker's yeast contains 51.8% proteins, peptones and amides, 29.5% gum and other carbohydrates, 1% fat, and 9.7% other substances. Class, now let's identify the functional groups in these important biological molecules that make up the molecules in bread and other delicious treats. Let's start with this one.
Well, there's an amine group and a carboxylic acid, so that's an amino acid.
That's correct. Amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. Now, what about this one?
That's an amide. Amides are carboxylic acid derivatives, which means they can be converted into carboxylic acids. The OH group is replaced by an amine.
Correct. Glucose, which is a simple sugar that makes up carbohydrates, has two forms. They're shown here. What are the different functional groups in each form?
Well, the straight train has hydroxy groups as well as an aldehyde. The ring is a hemiacetal. Those are tautomers of each other.
Good job.
Thank you so much, Professor.
Now, back to how baker's yeast works. When it comes into contact with water, it undergoes a process called fermentation, as it consumes simple sugars like the glucose here, and it releases carbon dioxide and ethanol. The balanced reaction is shown here. The carbon dioxide and ethanol bubbles off, lifting and aerating the dough. Yeast also converts soluble starch into malt sugar, which undergoes the same fermentation process as shown here. The gas bubbles that form rearrange the protein network to better form a polymer and give the bread structure.
Is yeast the only leavening agent?
Nope. Quick breads and cakes use inorganic leavening agents, such as baking powder and baking soda. Baking powder is made up of 3 components: acid, base, and filler. When you add water to baking powder, the dry acid and base go into solution and start reacting to form carbon dioxide bubbles. This is why most cake recipes have you mix dry ingredients and wet ingredients separately, so that the carbon dioxide bubbles are formed near the end of the mixing process. This is important for single-acting baking powder, which forms all of its bubbles when it gets wet. Single-acting baking powder is made up of sodium bicarbonate, potassium hydrogen tartrate, aka cream of tartar, as the acid, and cornstarch as filler. Because the base and acid react immediately upon addition of water, cornstarch is added to absorb some of the moisture and prevent premature activity.
The baking powder in my kitchen cabinet says it's double acting, not single acting.
Well, unlike single-acting baking powder, double-acting baking powder has 2 types of acids, which react at different times during the baking process. Like single-acting baking powder, it contains sodium bicarbonate and cream of tartar, which react when liquid is added. However, the second acid used is sodium aluminum sulfate. Sodium aluminum sulfate is acidic by nature. However, it's an insoluble crystalline powder, and it doesn't interact with sodium bicarbonate until it is fully melted at around 140 degrees Fahrenheit.
My professor instilled a love in me for mixing chemistry and baking together.
That's inspirational. But what can you tell me about gluten?
Hi, I'm Assistant Baker Bo.
You're the one who ran away from me earlier.
Oh, that's because Baker Bo is the expert on leavening agents, and my specialty is gluten, as you can see by my figure.
So, tell me, what does gluten do in bread?
Good question. Gluten development begins when the water is mixed into the flour. When hydrated, gluten and gliadin proteins almost immediately bind and form gluten. Gluten proteins, which are longer, link up with each other through disulfide bonds to form strong, stretchy units of molecules called polymers. The more compact gliadin proteins contribute to the dough's fluidity.
I think I've heard of this. It takes time to form the chemical attachments that knit gluten proteins together. Protein snipping enzymes, called proteases, start cutting long strands of gluten into smaller pieces, allowing those smaller pieces to make additional connections. Proteases is found in very low amounts in wheat flour because having too much protease would overcut the gluten strands and weaken the gluten network. The disulfide bonds and gluten that are broken mechanically during mixing can also be broken chemically by disulfide interchange, which is a series of reactions with cysteine and glutathione. These reactions are reversible so that the dough's stiffness can be controlled.
That's correct. As you continue to knead the dough, the chains of protein become more numerous and elongated. They organize into a web structure that has both elasticity and extensibility.
The network of gluten will continue to develop, becoming stronger and more complex until the dough is fully proofed. Enzymes have even more time to react while the dough rests and begins to ferment. Chains of gluten grow longer and stronger as more and more molecules stick together. Bakers, like myself, periodically fold the resting dough to help align the gluten strands into an even, organized structure, which gives the dough the integrity it needs to expand as the carbon dioxide produced by the yeast and water vapor are introduced into the bubbles.
Most of the carbon dioxide production during fermentation happens in the final proofing stage. The largest volume increase comes during baking, when the dough nearly doubles in volume in the oven. To expand during both processes, the dough must be strong enough to retain the gas that's produced. Gluten makes the dough elastic enough that the bubble walls can expand like a little balloon without tearing up until the point where the bread overproofs. When carbon dioxide exerts more pressure than a proof dough can withstand, the gluten structure weakens, releasing the gas and deflating the overproofed dough.
The type of flour you can use can influence the gluten development. Protein content varies among flours, and in most cases, the higher the protein content, the more gluten the dough can typically form. Bread flour contains the most gluten, cake flour contains the least, and all-purpose flour contains a medium amount. Generally, bread flours will give food volume and texture to a loaf. However, if you are baking a cake, you use a lower gluten flour because gluten networks can make a cake's texture rubbery.
Wow, I remember that in organic chemistry in Baking 101. My professor talked about the roles of salt. Salt provides more than flavor, it straightens the gluten bonding. Although the gluten proteins naturally repel one another, the chloride ions in salt help them overcome the repulsions and stick together. You can see this change happen within the dough when you add salt later in the mixing process. As the salt mixes in and dissolves, the tacky dough firms up.
Yep, fats such as butter and oils slow down the gluten forming process by coating the protein strands, which is one reason enriched doughs such as brioche call for longer mixing times. The coating acts like a barrier that prevents gluten proteins from sticking to one another, stunting the growth of long strands. Fat in large quantities hinder gluten formation and lead to a soft, tender crumb that is more like that of a cake.
Wow, I didn't realize there was so much involved in the process of baking breads and cakes. I feel so enlightened and hungry now.
Well, it's a good thing that we're in a bakery then. Let's dig in.
That's cake, not bread.
My bad. So y'all want it or not?
Let's eat